The neon glow of El Faro, a quiet yet lively bar in downtown Santiago, reflected off the polished wooden counter as David Vargas wiped down the last few glasses of the night. The rhythmic hum of passing cars outside, the faint murmur of jazz playing from an old radio in the corner, and the occasional clink of ice against glass created an atmosphere of familiarity, a place where people came to escape, just as he had. David had been working at El Faro for nearly 2 years now. The job was simple: keep the drinks flowing, listen to half-hearted confessions from tired businessmen, and make sure no fights broke out when egos ran high. But El Faro was more than just a bar. It was a place where he could disappear, where no one expected anything from him. That was exactly what he wanted: to stay unnoticed. But even in the dimly lit space, some ghosts refused to stay buried. Still hiding, hermano? David glanced up and saw Jackson Fuentes leaning against the bar, arms crossed, a familiar grin on his face. Jackson had a way of appearing out of nowhere, like he still had the instincts of the military pilot he once was. "Not hiding," David muttered, setting down the glass. "Just working." Jackson smirked. "Right, because being a bartender is exactly what a former Special Forces operative should be doing with his life." David didn't respond. He just turned, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and poured himself a small drink. He wasn't in the mood for this conversation. Jackson, however, didn't need an invitation. "I've got a flight tomorrow," he continued, sliding onto the bar stool. "A short trip over the Andes to a private island. Easy job. You should come." David shook his head immediately. "Not happening." Jackson sighed, drumming his fingers against the counter. "Man, when was the last time you did something other than pour drinks and brood?" David exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I like my life simple." Jackson leaned in slightly. "It's not simple, hermano. It's empty." Silence stretched between them. David hated that Jackson was right. Before he could argue, the door to the bar swung open, and in stepped Ana Montoya. She didn't belong here, not in her crisp white blazer, designer heels clicking against the floor, her hair neatly tied back, yet somehow effortlessly stylish. She radiated an air of confidence, of someone used to control. But there was something else, a weariness behind her sharp brown eyes. Henry Rojas, the bar's owner, immediately straightened, a polite smile forming on his lips. "Señorita Montoya," he greeted, wiping his hands on a towel. "Didn't expect to see you here." Anna's gaze flickered briefly to David, a moment of recognition flashing across her face before she masked it. "I needed a drink," she said simply. Henry nodded and gestured toward an empty seat on the house. David didn't react, but something inside him tightened. He had seen that look before, the look of someone trapped in a life they didn't want. He just didn't expect to see it in her. David pretended not to notice Anna's fleeting glance, but he felt it linger longer than it should. He had a feeling she recognized him, though he couldn't quite place where they might have crossed paths before. Instead of acknowledging it, he focused on the glass in his hand, swirling the last bit of whiskey before downing it in one gulp. Jackson, however, had no such reservations. "Didn't think a Montoya would be drinking at a place like this," he said, smirking. Anna barely reacted. "And I didn't think an ex-pilot would still be drinking like one." Jackson chuckled, raising his glass in surrender. "Fair enough." David finally looked at her directly. Up close, she was more guarded than she let on. It wasn't just exhaustion or stress. It was the look of someone who had been cornered, suffocating in their own world. He knew it all too well. "You here for something specific?" David asked, "or just slumming it for the night?" Anna tilted her head slightly as if debating whether to answer. I needed a break. David didn't push. If there was one thing he understood, it was the need to escape. Henry placed a drink in front of her, a smooth bourbon, neat. She took a slow sip, letting the burn settle before speaking again. I assume you've heard the rumors. David and Jackson exchanged a glance. About your father? Jackson asked. Yeah. Arturo Salazar's making moves. Ana exhaled, staring at the golden liquid in her glass. He's not just making moves. He's already inside. He has half the board in his pocket, and the other half is too weak to fight back. David frowned. He might have left behind the world of power plays and tactical maneuvers, but even he knew that once a predator got inside, it was only a matter of time before they took over. So, why are you telling us this? Jackson asked. Ana hesitated, then looked straight at David. Because my father isn't as strong as he used to be, she admitted quietly. And for some reason, he trusts you. David stiffened. He barely knew Ryan Montoya. A handful of run-ins, nothing significant. But something about the way Ana said it, as if she knew something he didn't, made his skin itch. I'm not in the business of saving rich men's empires, David muttered. Ana didn't look away. No, she said softly. But you're in the business of saving people? Silence settled over the bar again, but this time it was heavier. David wasn't sure why, but something about her words struck a nerve. Before he could respond, Jackson clapped his hands together. Well, that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, I'm just here to get my friend out of this cave of self-pity he calls a life. David shot him a glare. Jackson just grinned. So, what do you say, Hermano? You coming on that flight or what? David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to step back into that world. But the way Ana looked at him, like she expected him to be something more, was unsettling. Fine, he said at last. One flight. Jackson clapped him on the back, triumphant. That's the spirit. David ignored him, because deep down, he had a feeling this wasn't just one flight. It was the beginning of something he wasn't ready for. The Santiago sky was a perfect shade of blue, interrupted only by the distant outlines of the Andes Mountains, their snowy peaks, reflecting the early morning sunlight. The crisp air carried the sounds of a busy airstrip, engines humming, metal clanking, voices giving pre-flight instructions, a stark contrast to the quiet bar where David had spent most of his nights. He took a deep breath, feeling the unfamiliar weight of expectation settling over him. Tell me again why I let you talk me into this, David muttered as he stepped onto the tarmac. Jackson, already by the small twin-engine seaplane, grinned as he ran a final systems check. Because deep down, you missed the rush, David scoffed, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. I didn't miss anything. Jackson just laughed. Right. That's why you haven't been able to sleep for the past 2 years. David's jaw clenched. Damn Jackson for knowing him too well. Before he could respond, footsteps approached. Ana Montoya. She walked toward them with the same effortless grace she carried in the bar, but now, in the bright light of day, she looked different, less like the composed businesswoman from the night before, and more like someone on edge, determined to hold everything together. You're late, she said, crossing her arms. David raised an eyebrow. Didn't realize I was on a schedule? You are now. Ana handed Jackson a folder. Flight manifest, weather reports, emergency contacts. Jackson gave her a mock salute, flipping through the pages. You're thorough. I'll give you that. Ana didn't react. Instead, she turned to David. Her eyes locked onto his, like she was trying to read something in him. My father thinks you're someone worth trusting, she said after a pause. I'm not convinced yet. David smirked, the corner of his mouth tilting just slightly. Good. I'd hate to disappoint you too soon. Jackson snorted as he climbed into the cockpit. You two flirt like old married people. Anna shot him a glare, but David only shrugged, stepping onto the plane after Jackson. Once inside, he felt the weight of old habits kicking in, checking the exits, mapping the fastest escape routes, scanning for threats even though there were none. Instinct, muscle memory. He hated that it was still there. As Jackson powered up the engines, the radio crackled to life, with clearance instructions from the tower. Strap in, Jackson called over his shoulder. It's a smooth flight over the Andes, if the wind cooperates. If not, well, try not to scream. David rolled his eyes, but fastened his seatbelt. Anna, sitting across from him, did the same. She caught his gaze for a brief second, before turning toward the window. David didn't know why, but he had the distinct feeling this trip was about to change everything. The engines roared as the seaplane lifted off the ground, gliding effortlessly into the open sky. Santiago shrank beneath them, the city's skyline dissolving into a sprawling patchwork of roads, rooftops, and distant hills. The rising sun cast a golden glow over the Andes, their jagged peaks stretching across the horizon like ancient guardians. The vastness was breathtaking, even for David, who had spent most of his life in places where the sky was just another battlefield. Jackson whistled as he leveled out the plane. Nothing like it, huh? His voice crackled through the headset. This is what freedom feels like, hermano. No boardrooms, no war zones, just you and the open sky. David didn't respond, just stared out the window, absorbing the silence that came with altitude. But he knew Jackson was only half right. Freedom wasn't as simple as flying away from something. Some ghosts followed you, no matter how high you climbed. Across from him, Anna was seated upright, arms folded, her gaze shifting between the view outside and the instrument panel. Her demeanor was composed, but David noticed the slight tension in her posture, the way she tapped her fingers against her knee, the way her breathing deepened slightly when the plane hit a bit of turbulence. Not a fan of flying? He asked, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the engines. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. I don't like being in places I can't control. David smirked slightly. Welcome to my world. She let out a quiet exhale. Not quite a laugh, but something close to it. At least you're honest. Jackson adjusted a few switches, checking their heading. We'll hit the coastline in about 40 minutes. Then, it's a smooth run to the island. His voice was relaxed, confident, until he glanced at the instrument panel again. A small frown creased his forehead. David noticed immediately. Something wrong? Jackson hesitated before answering. Pressure's a little off. Nothing serious. Just means we might get some rough air heading into the pass. Anna stiffened, but David remained calm. A little turbulence wasn't new to him, but Jackson's fingers tapped absently against the throttle, his usual ease slipping just slightly. If it's nothing, then why do you look like you swallowed a bad drink? David asked. Jackson exhaled through his nose, adjusting the trim. Because I don't like when things don't match up. Instruments say one thing, but I'm feeling something different. Could be wind shifting, could be nothing. But I like knowing exactly what I'm dealing with. David studied him for a moment, then leaned back. He knew that look, the look of someone trying to ignore a bad feeling. He had worn it too many times himself. They flew in silence for a while. The only sound the steady hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. Below them, the Andes stretched in endless ridges, snow-capped peaks giving way to rocky valleys. The beauty of it was deceptive, This place could kill just as easily as it could mesmerize. And then it happened. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, a violent shake that sent Anna gripping the armrests tightly. Jackson cursed under his breath, hands steady on the controls. All right, all right. Nothing crazy, just some unstable air. We're fine. But David knew better. It wasn't just turbulence. There was a shift in the sound of the engines, a subtle but distinct change in pitch that only someone who had spent years in high-risk environments would catch. Something was off. He turned to Jackson. How bad? Jackson's grip on the yoke tightened just slightly. Not bad, but not great. The instruments were showing small inconsistencies, nothing that screamed emergency, but enough to make an experienced pilot uneasy. Anna, sensing the shift in their energy, leaned forward. What aren't you telling me? Jackson exhaled. We've got a bit of an imbalance in pressure. Could be a minor fuel line issue, or it could be nothing. Either way, I'm keeping an eye on it. David wasn't satisfied with that answer, but he knew pushing Jackson wouldn't help. He turned to Anna. Buckle in, just in case. She gave him a sharp look, but didn't argue, securing her harness a little tighter. The plane jolted again, not as violent as before, but enough to send a clear message. Something was coming. David had felt it too many times before. That strange, inexplicable shift in the air, the unspoken warning before chaos hit. And then, just as quickly as it started, everything settled. The plane evened out. The shaking stopped. For a moment, it seemed like Jackson was right. Maybe it was just the wind. Then Jackson's breath hitched. Ah, shit. The left engine coughed. Once, twice, then sputtered. Then silence. The propeller stopped. David didn't even hesitate. How much time? Jackson's voice was tense, but controlled. Depends. If I can restart it, we're fine. If not, we're going down a lot sooner than planned. Anna's fingers dug into the seat. How much time, Jackson? This time Jackson didn't sugarcoat it. Minutes. David's heart rate didn't spike. His breathing didn't change. Calm under fire. That's what they drilled into him. But his hands clenched into fists. Options? Jackson's eyes flicked between the gauges and the approaching peaks. Either we put her down now, while I still have some control, or we try for altitude and risk the ridge. David looked out the window. The ridge was sharp, unforgiving. The only thing worse than going down was going down there. How much control do you have left? Enough to pick a spot, but not enough to be picky. David turned to Anna, her face pale but steady. I hope you trust me now. She swallowed hard, gripping the harness. That depends. Are we about to crash? Jackson forced a chuckle. Not if I can help it. David nodded once. Then let's land this damn plane. The left engine remained dead, leaving the plane crippled in midair, gliding over the Andes, with nothing but gravity pulling them toward jagged peaks below. Jackson's hands were steady on the yoke, but David could see the muscle in his jaw tightening, a sure sign that things were worse than he was letting on. The radio crackled as Jackson made the distress call. Santiago Tower, this is Alpha 410, declaring an emergency. We've lost left engine, altitude dropping, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. Static. Then a response. Alpha 410, copy your emergency. What's your position? Jackson's fingers flicked switches, trying a manual restart, but the engine remained silent. Crossing the western ridge, descending at 1,500 feet per minute. Need a safe drop zone. The control tower's voice remained calm, but the tension was clear. Negative on immediate landing zones. Nearest viable strip is 40 clicks south. Can you maintain altitude? Jackson exhaled through his teeth. Not a chance. David glanced at Anna. Her hands were gripping the harness, so tight, her knuckles had turned white. But her breathing was even. Fear was there, but she was holding it together. That counted for something. Jackson tried restarting the engine again. Nothing. The wind resistance dragged against them. The mountains below, rising faster than they were falling. David had seen this before, in another life. A mission in the Middle East. A Black Hawk hit by enemy fire, spiraling down while the pilot barked out failed restart attempts. He remembered the impact, the screams, the silence that followed. He wouldn't live through that again. Options, he said, his voice even. Jackson cursed under his breath. I can put us down in that valley, but we're coming in hard. It's trees or rocks. Pick your poison. David scanned the terrain. The valley was narrow, flanked by cliffs. One wrong move, and they'd slam into stone before ever touching the ground. Go for the trees, David said. Jackson nodded once. All right. Brace. He killed the remaining engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The plane lurched downward, weightless for a split second, before gravity took hold. The mountains rushed up to meet them. Anna sucked in a sharp breath, but David's hand shot out, gripping hers just for a second, a silent promise that they'd make it. Then he let go and braced himself. Jackson wrestled with the yoke, eyes locked on the fast-approaching tree line. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Then impact. Branches shattered against the fuselage, metal screaming as the plane tore through the treetops. The world became a violent, twisting blur of green and brown. Something slammed into David's shoulder. The safety harness dug into his ribs. The nose dipped. Then everything went black. Pain was the first thing David registered. A sharp, burning ache in his shoulder, his ribs compressed like a vice, his lungs fighting to draw in air. His vision was blurry, a hazy mix of greens and browns, the remnants of the shattered cockpit pressing in around him. He groaned, forcing himself upright. The seatbelt was still tight across his chest, pinning him against the twisted remains of the seat. His ears were ringing, but beyond the high-pitched whine, he could hear something else. Breathing. Shallow. Uneven. Alive. Jackson. David blinked rapidly, clearing the blur. The cockpit was a mess of broken glass, torn metal, and leaking fuel. Jackson was slumped forward, blood trickling from cuts on his forehead, his hands still gripping the yoke in a final act of control. Jackson? David grunted, reaching over. The pilot groaned, shifting slightly. Alive. Good. David fought against the seatbelt, fingers fumbling as he released the buckle. Pain lanced through his side as he moved, but he pushed past it, survival instincts overriding everything else. He turned his head. Anna. Where was Anna? A panicked breath, then movement. She was in the back, tangled in the wreckage, her seatbelt still holding her in place, but twisted at an awkward angle. Her head was tilted down, a few strands of dark hair covering her face, but when she lifted it, her eyes locked onto his, wide, unfocused, but alive. Relief washed over him for just a second, before another reality set in. The plane was leaking fuel. Anna, David called, trying to shake off the dizziness. She blinked sluggishly, her movements sluggish. Why have to move? Now. She nodded weakly, but struggled against the restraint. David pushed past the searing pain in his ribs and crawled toward her, using whatever strength he had left to unbuckle her seatbelt. She collapsed forward, and he caught her just in time. Her body was trembling, but she wasn't critically injured. A concussion maybe, but nothing worse than bruises and shock. Jackson, she rasped. I've got him. David turned back, gripping Jackson's shoulder and shaking him hard. The pilot groaned but didn't move much. Too weak. David didn't have time for this. He reached down, unbuckled Jackson's harness, and hauled him out of the seat. His body protested with every motion, but he didn't stop. The air smelled wrong. Fuel, burning metal. The plane wasn't on fire yet, but it would be soon. They needed to get the hell out. Anna stumbled as she tried to stand, but David steadied her with one arm, while still dragging Jackson with the other. He kicked at the emergency exit hatch. Once, twice, and on the third strike, it gave way, the twisted door falling out into the dirt. Sunlight and fresh air hit them like a slap. They were in a clearing. David didn't waste time. He pulled Jackson out first, then turned to Anna. Go. Move. She didn't hesitate this time. They staggered away from the wreckage, feet crunching on fallen branches and damp earth, every step an effort against the pain. David barely made it 20 yards before a loud hissing sound cut through the air. Then, boom, the fuel ignited. A rush of heat exploded behind them, sending a wave of fire tearing through what was left of the aircraft. The shockwave knocked them forward, sending them sprawling into the dirt. David twisted mid-fall, keeping Anna from hitting the ground too hard, absorbing the impact with his already bruised body. Jackson landed beside them with a heavy thud, coughing violently. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of flames and the sharp ringing in David's ears. Then Anna lifted her head, chest heaving, face smudged with dirt and ash. She turned to look at the burning wreckage, her body trembling from more than just exhaustion. "We almost died," she whispered, her voice raw. David let out a sharp breath, forcing himself onto his elbows. He glanced toward the dense tree line, scanning for anything familiar. The Andes stretched endlessly in every direction, their position completely isolated. No roads, no landmarks, no signs of human presence. They were alone. Jackson groaned beside him. "Yeah," the pilot muttered, voice hoarse. "And it's about to get a hell of a lot worse." David followed his gaze. A storm was rolling over the mountains, dark clouds swallowing the sky. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees like a warning. They weren't just stranded. They were running out of time. David forced himself to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The wreckage of the plane burned behind them, black smoke curling into the sky, a signal of their crash to anyone or anything watching. The flames crackled, their heat pushing against his back, as he turned his attention to their immediate problem: survival. Anna was still on her knees, one hand pressed to the ground as she tried to steady herself. Jackson, though conscious, looked like hell. His forehead was slick with blood, and his left arm hung at an awkward angle, probably dislocated. David knew they couldn't stay here. The fire would attract attention, but not necessarily the right kind. Jackson wiped at the blood on his face, wincing. "Remind me to never let you convince me to land in trees again." David ignored the joke and scanned their surroundings. The clearing was small, bordered by dense forest that stretched toward the towering peaks of the Andes. The terrain was rugged, the ground uneven and damp from recent rainfall. No visible trails, no sign of civilization. Anna followed his gaze, her breathing still uneven. "Where the hell are we?" David exhaled through his nose, deep in the mountains, probably 20 miles from the nearest village. Anna wiped sweat from her brow, eyes darting back toward the fire. "So, what's the plan?" David turned to Jackson. "Can you move?" Jackson flexed his injured arm and grimaced. "I can move. Can't promise I'll be fast." "Good enough." David shifted his focus. "First priority is getting away from the wreck. We're too exposed here." Anna hesitated. "Shouldn't we stay put?" The fire makes us easier to find. David shook his head. It makes us easier to find, but it also makes us a target. And with that storm moving in, he gestured toward the dark clouds rolling over the mountains. We don't want to be stuck out in the open. Anna opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but closed it just as quickly. She knew he was right. David moved first, stepping toward the tree line, testing the ground for stability. The air was already shifting, the temperature dropping slightly. A bad sign. Jackson groaned as he pushed himself up. If we're hiking through the jungle, at least tell me there's a 5-star resort on the other side. David didn't answer. He had no intention of giving false hope. Anna glanced at the sky. How long before the storm hits? David studied the low-hanging clouds, the shifting wind, calculating. Couple of hours, maybe less. Anna nodded tightly. Then, let's move. Together they left the wreckage behind, stepping into the shadows of the forest, unaware that something or someone was already watching them. The moment they stepped into the dense forest, the temperature dropped noticeably. The thick canopy overhead swallowed most of the sunlight, leaving only fractured beams of light piercing through the gaps. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the sounds of the burning wreckage faded into the distance, replaced by the subtle rustle of leaves shifting in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Every step deeper into the jungle felt like stepping further away from safety. David took the lead, moving with purpose but not haste, scanning the terrain for signs of a viable path. The ground was uneven, roots twisting across their way, like traps waiting to send them tumbling. Survival in the wild wasn't foreign to him, but the Andes were unpredictable. Weather, terrain, and whatever else might be lurking out here. Jackson followed behind him, cradling his injured arm against his chest, his breathing steady but labored. Anna walked beside Jackson, her expression set in quiet determination. Though David caught the way her eyes flicked around their surroundings, wary, calculating. She wasn't just afraid, she was thinking, planning. How much farther do we need to go? She finally asked. David glanced up at the shifting sky through the trees. Far enough that if anyone comes looking, they don't find us first. She frowned but didn't argue. And after that? David hesitated. We find shelter, water. Figure out if there's a way to signal for help. Jackson exhaled sharply, kicking a loose rock aside. And if help doesn't come? David didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't like their odds. They had no supplies, no weapons, and no guarantee anyone even knew where to look. Anna must have sensed his hesitation, because she spoke up again. My father will send people? David arched a brow. You sure about that? She didn't flinch. Yes. David held her gaze for a moment before nodding. Then, let's hope they're faster than the storm. As if on cue, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the mountains. The wind had picked up, rustling through the branches, carrying the scent of rain. The storm was coming in faster than he'd predicted. David quickened his pace, pushing through thick underbrush, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every shadow, every shift in the trees felt like something just out of sight. He'd felt this before. The weight of unseen eyes, the creeping feeling that they weren't alone. And then he heard it. A low, deliberate snap of a branch. Not an animal, someone. David's body went rigid. He stopped walking and lifted a hand, signaling silent halt. Anna and Jackson froze behind him. Jackson gave him a confused look, but Anna understood immediately. Her fingers curled slightly, instinctively bracing for something she couldn't yet see. David listened. The forest wasn't just alive with the wind. It was breathing, watching. Someone was out there. And whoever they weren't alone. David didn't move. Every muscle in his body remained still, ears tuned to the subtle shifts in the air, the distant murmur of the storm pressing closer. The snap of the branch had been deliberate, too heavy for an animal, too precise for chance. They were being watched. Anna, standing just behind him, had stiffened, her breath shallow but controlled. Jackson, still favoring his injured arm, was slower to react, his brow furrowing in confusion as his gaze darted between them. He hadn't heard it. Not yet. David raised a hand, fingers barely moving, as he signaled silent wait. Years of training had drilled response times into him, but he didn't know if Jackson or Anna had the same instincts. He hoped they'd follow his lead. A second sound. Closer. This time it wasn't a branch snapping, but the rustle of leaves shifting unnaturally. Something brushing against them. Someone moving carefully, deliberately. Not running. Not rushing. Stalking. David exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing, as he surveyed the dense brush ahead. His mind worked through possibilities. Could be scavengers, could be local hunters, could be something worse. A new sound, low. Software a whistle. Not random. Not the wind. A signal. His pulse steadied. They weren't just being watched. They were being tracked. David turned slightly, his voice just a whisper. "We're not alone." Anna swallowed hard, but gave a small nod, her grip tightening at her sides. Jackson's fingers flexed near his injured arm, frustration flickering across his face. "How many?" he whispered back. David's eyes flicked toward the shifting shadows between the trees. "At least 2. Maybe more." Anna's breath hitched. "Locals?" David didn't answer. He didn't know. And that was the problem. Another sound, this time from behind. David's jaw clenched. They weren't just watching. They were surrounding them. "We move," David said under his breath, his voice calm but firm. "Now." Anna hesitated only a second before nodding. Jackson exhaled, shifting his weight as he prepared to follow. Then, a voice. Low, rough, edged with an accent David didn't immediately place. Not Spanish. Something else. "You're trespassing." David turned slowly, his instincts on high alert. A man stepped from the trees, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Another figure appeared to the left, then another to the right. They weren't just surrounded. They were outnumbered. And David had a sinking feeling that whoever these men were, they weren't here to help. David's instincts sharpened. The air felt different now, charged with something unseen but unmistakable, a shift in control. He had felt it before, in tense negotiations and uncertain battlefield situations, a moment where words mattered more than actions. The man standing before them wasn't just a wanderer or a hunter. His posture, his deliberate movements, the confidence in his stance, it all pointed to someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Didn't realize this land was private," David said, keeping his voice even but firm. The man smirked slightly. "Everything in these mountains belongs to someone." He nodded toward the burning wreckage in the distance, black smoke curling into the sky like a signal. "Lucky we found you first." David kept his expression neutral, but his mind worked quickly. They weren't lost anymore. They had been found, and that meant someone had been watching. Anna took a small step forward, carefully choosing her words. "We're just trying to get back to the nearest village. If you help us, we'll make sure you're compensated." The man's eyes flickered with amusement. "Compensation?" He turned his attention fully to her now, studying her closely. "That depends. What's a Montoya worth these days?" David felt Anna stiffen. His stomach dropped slightly. They knew. The man's smirk deepened. "Thought I recognized you," he mused. "Ryan Montoya's daughter. Long way from your father's world, aren't you?" Anna held her composure, but David caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers curled slightly, how she exhaled just a little slower. They hadn't just stumbled upon strangers. This meeting wasn't a coincidence. David exchanged a glance with Jackson, whose jaw was set, his injured arm still tucked quite to his body. Jackson had clearly come to the same conclusion. Whoever these men were, they had been expecting something, or someone. David's voice was steady. If you know who she is, then you know her father will send people looking. The man gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. That's the part I'm counting on. David felt the full weight of those words settle in his chest. This wasn't a rescue. It was an arrangement. The leader of the group turned slightly to his men, then back to David, Anna, and Jackson. You want to get out of these mountains? We can help with that. His smile didn't reach his eyes. But it's going to cost you. David kept his expression unreadable, but inside, he was already calculating their next move. They weren't out of danger yet. David kept his expression neutral, but inside, his mind worked at full capacity, analyzing every word, every movement from the men standing before them. The leader, calm, collected, and clearly in charge, had positioned himself like someone used to negotiation. He wasn't making threats, but he wasn't offering favors either. This was a transaction, and they were the goods. Anna stood tall beside him, her face unreadable, though David could sense the tension in her shoulders. She was weighing the situation just as he was, trying to determine whether these men were potential allies or unavoidable obstacles. Jackson, despite his injury, kept his expression impassive, but David saw the way he adjusted his stance, subtly bracing himself in case this situation took an unexpected turn. Even wounded, he wasn't someone to underestimate. The leader finally broke the silence. You said you need help getting out of the mountains. We can provide that. But you understand that nothing here comes free. David exhaled slowly. That depends on what you're asking. The man smiled slightly, but it wasn't reassuring. Let's start simple. Supplies, food, water, shelter. We can offer all of that, while we figure out the best way to arrange your return. David narrowed his eyes. And what do you want in exchange? The leader's gaze flicked to Anna. Leverage. David felt Anna stiffen beside him, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The implication was clear. She was valuable, and these men knew it. Before David could respond, another man approached from the tree line, a little younger than the leader, but carrying himself with the same confidence. He leaned close and whispered something in the leader's ear. The man's expression remained unreadable, but he nodded before returning his attention to them. We should keep moving, he said, gesturing toward the dense forest. The storm will be on us soon. David didn't like this. They had no real choice but to follow, but walking deeper into unknown territory, with a group of men who clearly had their own agenda, was dangerous. He glanced at Anna and Jackson. Jackson gave a barely perceptible nod, understanding that playing along for now was their only option. Anna, though clearly reluctant, exhaled quietly before speaking. Fine. But if we're doing this, we want answers. Who exactly are you? The leader's smirk returned. As if he appreciated the directness, he turned and began walking, expecting them to follow. Call me Emilio, he said over his shoulder. And don't worry, Miss Montoya. You'll have plenty of time to learn more. David hated how easily Emilio said her name. Still they followed, stepping into the unknown, with no idea what awaited them ahead. The air inside the dense forest was thicker, heavier, the towering trees stretching high above them, their trunks forming an almost impenetrable wall. The deeper they walked, The less light reached them, the temperature dropping steadily as the storm pressed in. Every now and then, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the mountains, a reminder that time wasn't on their side. David stayed close to Anna and Jackson, his senses sharp, listening to every sound, every shift in the group's formation. Emilio and his men moved with familiarity, comfortable in this terrain. That meant they had been here a long time, long enough to know all the ways in and out. Escape wouldn't be easy. The ground beneath them was uneven, damp from earlier rains. The group walked at a steady pace, but David could tell Emilio was leading them somewhere specific, not just moving for shelter. That worried him. After nearly 30 minutes of silence, Anna spoke up. "Where exactly are we going?" Emilio didn't turn. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer," she pressed. Emilio finally glanced back, amusement flickering in his gaze. "You don't trust me?" Anna's expression remained cool. "Would you?" The other men chuckled quietly, as if they found her response entertaining. But David didn't miss the way Emilio's jaw tightened just slightly before his smirk returned. "We're taking you to our camp," Emilio finally answered, stepping over a fallen log. "Better than wandering these mountains aimlessly, don't you think?" David spoke up this time. "And once we get there," Emilio shrugged, "we talk. We figure out a plan. You want to get back to Santiago? I can make that happen. But," he tilted his head slightly, "I need to know that we can trust each other first." David didn't like the sound of that. Jackson, who had been silent most of the journey, exhaled sharply. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You conveniently find us after we crash, know exactly who Anna is, and now we're supposed to trust that this is all just a coincidence?" Emilio chuckled. "Coincidence? Number." He stopped walking and turned fully toward them, his tone shifting slightly. "But an opportunity? Maybe." David didn't move, didn't blink. Everything about this felt wrong. Anna crossed her arms. "So, what's the real story then?" Emilio studied her for a moment, as if debating how much to say. Then, with a smirk, he motioned toward one of his men. The man stepped forward, pulling a satellite phone from his pack. David's stomach clenched. They had outside communication. "Here's how this works," Emilio said, tossing the phone lightly in his hand before gripping it tight. "You call your father. Tell him you're safe, that you're with people who can get you home." Anna's eyes narrowed. "And what do you get in return?" Emilio's smirk deepened. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill. We help you, and in exchange, maybe your father does a little something for us." David immediately saw the trap. This wasn't about helping them. It was about control. By making Anna place the call, Emilio was setting the terms of negotiation without making an outright demand. And worse, he was making it seem like her idea. Anna was sharp, and David knew she recognized it too. But she also knew this call was their best chance at getting help. She hesitated for only a second before extending her hand. "Give me the phone." Emilio smiled and handed it to her. "Smart girl." Anna pressed the power button, and as the device lit up, David caught a glimpse of the GPS coordinates flashing on the screen. He committed them to memory instantly. If they needed to escape, he would know where to start. Anna raised the phone to her ear. It rang. Once, twice. Then a voice picked up. "Papa." David watched as relief flooded Anna's face for the first time since the crash. But as Emilio listened closely, his expression unreadable, David knew that whatever happened next wouldn't be as simple as a rescue. They had just entered a negotiation they weren't prepared for. Anna held the phone tight against her ear, her fingers gripping the edge just a little too hard. The familiar voice on the other end was steady, calm. But beneath it, David could hear the controlled urgency. Ryan Montoya, even in a crisis, didn't let panic slip into his words. "Papa, I'm safe." A short pause. Then Ryan's voice, firm but measured. "Where are you?" Anna exhaled, glancing at Emilio, who stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her closely. "Somewhere in the Andes. We survived the crash, but we're with a group that found us. They have supplies, a camp." She hesitated before adding, "They know who I am." Another pause. Then Ryan's tone shifted, not quite anger, but something colder. "And what do they want?" Anna's grip on the phone tightened. "They say they want to help." David watched as Emilio's expression remained unreadable, but the way he shifted slightly, just the smallest movement, told him that he was listening to every word. "Put one of them on the phone," Ryan said. Anna hesitated, but she knew she couldn't stall. She held the phone out to Emilio, who took it with a small, satisfied smile and raised it to his ear. "Señor Montoya," Emilio greeted, his tone polite, almost friendly. "I'm glad to hear your daughter made contact. You must be relieved." David watched closely. This was the real game now. Emilio wasn't just some opportunist. He was calculated, deliberate, setting the tone of the conversation before Ryan could. "I want to know who I'm speaking to," Ryan said. Emilio smirked. "Just a man who saw an opportunity to help. You know how these mountains are. Dangerous, unpredictable. It's good your daughter found us first." David recognized the tactic immediately. Emilio was implying that if it hadn't been them, it could have been someone worse. A favor disguised as a warning. Ryan didn't take the bait. "Tell me what you want." Emilio let the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary. Then he said, "For now, nothing. Your daughter is safe. Her friends are safe. We'll make sure they stay that way until we arrange for them to come home." David saw Anna's jaw tighten. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. There it was, the unspoken price. Ryan wasn't fooled either. His voice remained calm, but a slight edge slipped through. "If you're expecting a ransom, nothing so crude." Emilio interrupted smoothly. "We're not criminals, senor. We simply believe that sometimes relationships are more valuable than money." David's stomach tensed. He knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't just about Anna. They wanted something bigger, something Ryan Montoya had. And David had a sinking feeling that this negotiation was just getting started. Ryan didn't respond immediately. The silence on the other end of the call was deliberate, a calculated move from a man who had built an empire on understanding leverage. Emilio might have expected aggression, demands, maybe even threats, but instead, Ryan was making him wait. David knew exactly what was happening. Power plays weren't about who spoke first, but who controlled the silence. Finally, Ryan's voice came through, cool and sharp. "So, you're telling me this is just an act of generosity?" Emilio chuckled softly, pacing a slow circle around the clearing, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Generosity is a rare thing in our world, Señor Montoya. But trust? That's even rarer." He glanced at Anna, then Jackson. Then, finally, his gaze landed on David. His smirk deepened just slightly, like he knew something David didn't. David didn't like it. "We're in no rush," Emilio continued smoothly. "We'll take good care of them. Of course, if you'd like to arrange a return, I'm sure we can discuss how best to make that happen." Ryan exhaled, slow and deliberate. "What are you really asking for?" Emilio's smile remained, but the shift in his posture gave him away. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Just a conversation. a chance to discuss some mutual interests in person. David's eyes narrowed. That wasn't just a request for a ransom payment or a simple exchange. Emilio didn't want money. He wanted Ryan Montoya himself. Anna's face remained impassive, but David caught the flicker of realization in her eyes. Jackson stiffened beside him. Ryan's voice came through, still impossibly calm. "Where?" "We'll send details when the time is right," Emilio said, his tone light, as if they were arranging a business meeting instead of a negotiation over his daughter's safety. "Until then, your daughter is in good hands." A pause. Then Ryan's voice dropped slightly, carrying an unmistakable edge. "Put her back on the phone." Emilio held the phone out, his expression amused. Anna hesitated only for a second before taking it. "Papa," she said quietly. "You okay?" Ryan's voice softened, just a fraction. Anna nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Yes." "I'll handle this," he assured her. "Just stay where you are." Anna closed her eyes for half a second, then said, "I know." Then the call ended. Anna lowered the phone slowly, staring at the device in her hand. For the first time since the crash, David saw something flicker in her expression. A brief crack in the composed exterior, a glimpse of the weight pressing down on her. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She turned to Emilio, her posture controlled once more. "You think forcing my father into a meeting is going to work?" Emilio smirked. "Your father knows how the world works. He'll come." David had no doubt that was true. But the real question was, what would Ryan Montoya be walking into when he did? David didn't know yet, but he intended to find out. David sat near the edge of the encampment, his back against a tree, his mind working through everything that had just happened. This wasn't just a ransom situation. If Emilio's goal had been money, he would have asked for it outright. Instead, he had set the stage for a meeting, one where Ryan Montoya himself would have to come. Why? David glanced across the camp. It was a well-organized operation, nothing like a group of desperate scavengers trying to extort a quick payday. The men moved with efficiency, their supplies neatly stored under makeshift tarps, their weapons secured, but never out of reach. They weren't amateurs. This was a controlled environment, and that was what bothered David the most. Anna sat nearby, arms folded tightly across her chest, staring into the fire. Her jaw was set, her mind clearly racing through the same thoughts. David could tell she wasn't just worried about herself. She was thinking about her father, about what kind of game Emilio was playing. Jackson, who had been quiet for most of the day, shifted beside them, adjusting his injured arm. "Well," he muttered, "that could have gone worse." David arched a brow. "How exactly?" Jackson exhaled. "They could have taken the phone and cut off contact completely. At least now, we know Ryan is coming." David didn't reply, but he wasn't so sure that was a good thing. Across the clearing, Emilio stood talking to two of his men. His expression relaxed, but David could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't nervous. He was in control. Whatever he had planned, he had anticipated every step so far. That meant he had also anticipated what Ryan Montoya would do next. Anna must have been thinking the same thing, because she suddenly stood up and marched toward Emilio. David didn't stop her. He wanted to hear what she had to say. Emilio looked amused when she approached, his hands resting casually on his belt. "Señorita Montoya," he greeted. "Settling in?" Anna didn't take the bait. "Oh, what do you really want?" Emilio chuckled. "I told you. A conversation with my father." He nodded. "Your father has something I need. He's a businessman. He'll understand." Anna crossed her arms. "If this was just about a business deal, you wouldn't have gone through all this trouble." Emilio's smirk faltered just slightly before returning, a crack in the act. David noticed it immediately. "You're right," Emilio admitted. "It's not just business, it's about insurance." Anna frowned. "What kind of insurance?" Emilio exhaled, glancing around the camp before locking eyes with her. "The kind that keeps people alive." David felt something shift. That wasn't the answer he had expected. And for the first time since meeting Emilio, he wasn't sure if this man was the real threat, or if there was something even bigger coming. Anna's brow furrowed, her stance firm, despite the weight of Emilio's words. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice steady. Emilio studied her for a long moment, before shaking his head slightly. "It means," he said, "that your father isn't the only one with enemies." David's senses sharpened. This wasn't just a power play anymore. There was something deeper at work. Anna didn't back down. "You expect me to believe you're doing this for survival?" Emilio smirked, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Señorita Montoya. But whether you trust me or not, your father is walking into a situation he doesn't understand yet. And if you care about his life, you might want to start listening." David stood then, stepping forward. "Listening to what, exactly?" Emilio exhaled through his nose, like a man debating how much to reveal. "There are people watching this deal. Bigger than me, bigger than Montoya. If your father walks into this blind, he won't be walking out." Anna crossed her arms. "So you're saying you're the good guy now?" Emilio chuckled. "I'm saying I'm the only one telling you the truth." David had dealt with enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize a controlled leak of information. Emilio was offering just enough truth to be convincing, but not enough to reveal the full picture. Jackson, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Then why not tell Ryan everything outright? If this is bigger than you, why drag us into it?" Emilio turned toward him, his expression hardening slightly. "Because trust is currency," he said simply. "And right now, Montoya doesn't trust me, but he trusts his daughter." David immediately saw the angle. This wasn't just about using Anna as leverage. Emilio was positioning her as a messenger. If Ryan Montoya was walking into a trap, Emilio wanted Anna to be the one to warn him, which meant Emilio wasn't calling the shots. Someone else was. Anna must have realized it too, because she finally looked uncertain for the first time. "You're afraid of them," she said quietly. Emilio didn't respond, and that was answer enough. David exhaled. The situation had just changed. They weren't just hostages. They were pieces on a much bigger board. And whatever game was being played, they had just become part of it. The campfire flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing as the wind carried the distant growl of thunder. The storm was close now, the humidity thick in the air, pressing down like a warning. But the real storm wasn't in the sky. It was unfolding right here, in the space between Emilio, Anna, David, and Jackson. David sat near the edge of the fire, hands loosely clasped. But his mind was racing. Something wasn't adding up. If Emilio was afraid of whoever was behind this, then that meant one thing: he wasn't in control. And that was dangerous, because it meant there was another player in the game they hadn't seen yet. Anna was still standing, arms crossed tightly, as if holding herself together. She had been quiet since Emilio's last words, but David knew her well enough now to recognize the storm brewing beneath the surface. She was putting the pieces together, just like he was. "You want me to warn my father," Anna finally said, her voice measured. "But you won't tell me what he's walking into." Emilio exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Because I don't know exactly what's coming," he admitted. "But I know enough to say this: Ryan Montoya has more enemies than he realizes. Anna's expression didn't change, but David caught the slight shift in her posture. That statement had struck a nerve. Jackson, still cradling his injured arm, leaned forward slightly. So what? You're trying to save his life, out of the goodness of your heart. Emilio smirked. I wouldn't go that far. His gaze flicked to David. But I know a man who's been on the wrong side of an ambush before. David's muscles tensed, but he didn't react. Emilio tilted his head slightly. Tell me, soldier, how do you think this plays out if your boss walks into a trap blind? David didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, measuring the weight of it. Ryan Montoya wasn't a fool. He had built a business empire, navigated some of the most ruthless markets in the world. But business wasn't war. If he thought this was just about negotiation, then he was already in danger. David exhaled. You're worried about him, he said slowly, watching Emilio closely. Because if he walks into something bigger than a ransom exchange, then you're exposed too. Emilio's jaw tightened slightly. You could say that. David leaned forward slightly. So, tell me the real reason you're doing this. The silence stretched, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Then, Emilio said something that made everything click into place. Because I used to work for them. David went still. Anna inhaled sharply. Jackson muttered a curse under his breath. Emilio didn't look at any of them. As he continued, his voice lower now, edged with something David hadn't heard before. Something close to regret. I walked away, he said. Thought I could disappear. But you don't leave people like that. You don't just move on. David had seen this before. Men who had tried to outrun their past, only to find it waiting for them. Anna stepped closer. Who are they? Emilio's lips pressed into a thin line. You'll find out soon enough. David's gut tightened. That meant one thing. Whoever they were already on their way. The weight of Emilio's words settled over them, like the thick humidity in the air. The fire crackled, but no one spoke for a long moment. David felt the shift in the energy around them. This wasn't just about money, leverage, or power anymore. There was something deeper, more personal in Emilio's voice. David had spent years reading people, understanding when a man was bluffing, and when he was speaking a truth he wished he didn't have to say aloud. And Emilio? He was the latter. Anna exhaled, rubbing her hands over her arms, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had just learned. So, you're telling me, she said carefully, that my father isn't just walking into a negotiation. He's walking into a trap set by the same people you used to work for. Emilio nodded once. Jackson scoffed, shifting his injured arm. Great. So now we're what? Pawns in some kind of civil war? Emilio's smirk was humorless. Call it whatever you want. David didn't care what it was called. He cared about how to get them out of it. Who are they? He asked, his voice low, steady. Emilio hesitated for the first time, not because he was hiding the answer, because saying it out loud meant acknowledging something that still had power over him. Then, he exhaled. They call themselves La Sombra. David's stomach tightened. The Shadow. He had heard the name before. Whispers of a group operating in South America, dangerous but careful. Pulling strings in the background of major business deals, corporate takeovers, and, when necessary, making people disappear. They weren't just criminals. They were professionals. Anna's face paled slightly. You worked for La Sombra. Emilio's gaze darkened. A long time ago. David's mind worked fast. If Emilio had been part of them, but left, that meant La Sombra wasn't just coming for Ryan Montoya. They were coming for Emilio, too. Anna stepped forward, her voice sharp now. Why my father? Why now? Emilio rubbed the back of his neck, tension tightening his shoulders. Because your father has something they want. Anna's eyes narrowed. The hotel? Emilio shook his head. Number. Not just the hotel. Control. David sat up straighter. It made sense. La Sombra didn't just take over businesses. They took over power structures. If Ryan Montoya controlled an empire, that meant he controlled influence, and influence was worth more than money. David looked at Emilio. And you? Why are you so worried about them now? Emilio hesitated. Then for the first time, he looked uneasy. Oh, because I know how they work, he admitted. And I know what happens next. Anna's jaw tightened. And what happens next? Emilio exhaled, eyes flicking to the dark sky overhead. They don't wait for the meeting, Señorita Montoya. He turned back to them, his voice quiet but certain. They're already coming. The words settled into the air like a warning, just as the first crack of lightning split the sky. David's pulse quickened. The storm wasn't the only thing closing in. They were running out of time. The first crack of thunder rolled through the valley, deep and resonant, as if the mountains themselves were warning them. The sky had darkened considerably, thick storm clouds swallowing what little light remained. A gust of wind cut through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and something else, the distinct stillness that preceded danger. David didn't like it. They had spent too much time talking, too much time thinking, while the real threat was moving unseen. La Sombra wouldn't wait. They wouldn't give warnings. If Emilio was right, and David was certain he was, then whoever was coming was already too close for comfort. Anna must have sensed it too, because she turned to Emilio, her voice sharper now. If they're already coming, why the hell are we still standing here? Emilio exhaled, but there was tension in his posture. Because running blind gets us killed faster. You need a plan. David had been formulating one since the moment La Sombra's name had entered the conversation. He turned to Emilio. How do they operate? Emilio hesitated, then answered. Silent. Precise. They don't send an army. They send a handful of people who can get the job done without making a mess. David nodded. Then we assume they're already watching us. Jackson shifted, glancing toward the tree line. So, what's the move? David's mind worked fast. They were deep in the Andes, cut off from immediate backup, and the storm was rolling in fast. Visibility would be low. Communications could go down. That meant whoever struck first would have the advantage. We get out of the open, David said. Move before they box us in. Anna's jaw clenched, but she nodded. She knew better than to argue now. Emilio hesitated. We can use the old storage cabin down the ridge. It's got a radio. We can call for extraction from there. David locked eyes with him. And will they expect that? Emilio hesitated just long enough for David to have his answer. Yes. That's not an escape route, David said. That's a trap. A bolt of lightning flashed, illuminating the mountains for a fraction of a second, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder that shook the ground. The storm was moving faster now, the wind whipping through the trees, leaves rustling in a way that didn't sound entirely natural. David stiffened. They weren't alone anymore. He turned sharply toward the tree line. Something had shifted, a presence. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. Watching. Closing in. David's voice dropped. Move. Now. No one questioned him. They turned as one, heading for cover. But it was already too late. The storm wasn't the only thing about to break. The rain came in fast and hard, drumming against the canopy overhead, As the wind howled through the trees, the air was thick with moisture, the storm making every breath feel heavy. Visibility dropped instantly, the dense jungle turning into a shifting mass of shadows and movement. David didn't slow down. They had wasted too much time already. His instincts screamed at him. They were being hunted. Jackson kept close behind him, his footsteps uneven, but determined despite his injury. Anna moved with quick precision, her breathing controlled but tense. Emilio, for all his smug confidence earlier, was fully alert now, his body language that of a man who knew exactly how bad things could get. "Storage cabin," David said, barely audible over the rain. "How far?" Emilio glanced over his shoulder, his expression tight. 15 minutes, maybe 10 if we move fast." David didn't like those odds. 10 minutes was an eternity when you were being tracked. Then it happened. A single unnatural sound, the distinct snap of a branch, somewhere off to their right. David froze, his hand instinctively reaching out to stop Anna and Jackson from moving forward. His pulse slowed, his senses heightened. That sound hadn't come from the storm. Someone was there. Anna's breath hitched beside him. She had heard it too. David motioned for silence. The jungle had fallen too quiet. The storm raged above them, but in between the gusts of wind and rain, there was an unsettling absence of natural noise. No rustling animals, no insects, nothing. Then, another shift in the darkness. A presence, close. David's grip on reality narrowed to pure instinct. He turned to Emilio, his voice low but firm. "They're flanking us." Emilio cursed under his breath, scanning the jungle. "We have to keep moving." David agreed, but he also knew moving blind would get them killed faster. He made a split-second decision. "We change course," David said, already adjusting their path. "Southwest, toward the ridge." Emilio frowned. "The ridge is exposed." "Exactly," David interrupted. "Which means we'll see them before they see us." Emilio hesitated, but Jackson was already following David's lead. "I like his plan better than yours," Jackson muttered. Anna didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. They moved fast, cutting toward the ridge as the rain pounded down in sheets, their boots slipping slightly in the wet mud. The incline was brutal, but it was the only way to buy time. Then, a shadow moved. David saw it first, a figure just barely visible through the storm, crouched low between the trees, watching, waiting. David's blood went cold. La Sombra had arrived. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. They weren't stumbling into a trap. They were already in one. He turned sharply. "Run!" The word barely left his lips before all hell broke loose. The jungle erupted. Figures moved from the shadows, cutting through the rain like phantoms. La Sombra had been waiting for this exact moment. David grabbed Anna's wrist, pulling her forward as the group broke into a sprint, the storm swallowing their movement as the ridge came into view. Lightning split the sky. A single deafening crack echoed through the mountains. Not thunder, a gunshot. David knew two things immediately. They were out of time, and someone was already hit. The gunshot cut through the storm, sharp and unforgiving. It wasn't wild or panicked. It was precise, the kind of shot fired by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. David didn't stop running. He didn't turn to see who had been hit. That hesitation would be the difference between survival and failure. Right now, the only option was forward. The ridge loomed ahead, the jagged incline slick with rain and mud. The storm howled around them, the wind lashing through the trees, but David could still hear the movement behind them. The careful, disciplined pursuit of trained hunters. La Sombra didn't rush. They didn't need to. They were closing in. Keep moving, David shouted over the storm, pulling Anna forward as her feet slipped slightly on the wet ground. Jackson was close behind, his injured arm cradled against his chest, but his expression was focused, adrenaline keeping him upright. Then came the second shot, a sharp crack, followed by the unmistakable impact of a bullet embedding itself into wood. David whipped his head toward the source, a figure barely visible through the rain, crouched low, rifle steady. They were boxed in. Emilio cursed under his breath, pressing himself against a boulder for cover. "They're pushing us toward the edge." David's mind worked at full speed. The ridge was close, maybe 100 feet ahead, but beyond that was a steep drop into unknown terrain. The only thing between them and the fall was a thinning tree line and an open stretch of rock. If they broke into the open now, they'd be easy targets. Anna was breathing hard beside him, her hair soaked from the rain, but her gaze was locked onto the figures moving through the jungle. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating. David turned to Emilio. "How many are out there?" Emilio wiped water from his face. "At least 4. Maybe more." David clenched his jaw. They couldn't fight them head on. Not like this. Then he saw it. A narrow rock outcrop that extended along the ridge. Unstable, dangerous, but their only chance. If they could move along it, La Sombra would have to follow single file. No angles for crossfire. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than dying here. David turned to the others. "We go along the ridge." Jackson gave him a look. "That thing barely looks like it can hold weight." "Then don't stop moving," David shot back. No one argued, because no one had a better idea. Anna went first, moving fast but careful, her boots skidding slightly on the slick stone. Emilio followed, Jackson right behind him. David stayed last, glancing back just in time to see a shadow emerge from the trees, rifle raised. He moved, just as the next shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock, just inches from David's hand, sending a sharp crack through the air as stone fragments exploded outward. He ducked instinctively, his body already moving before his mind had fully caught up. No time to think, only react. The others were already ahead, racing along the narrow rock outcrop, the storm making the surface even more treacherous. The ridge was a deadly combination of loose gravel, jagged edges, and a sheer drop on one side that plunged into the jungle far below. David could hear La Sombra moving behind them now, their footfalls calculated, their presence an unshakable force, pressing them forward. Another shot cracked through the air, this one closer. David turned his head, just in time, to see a figure breaking from the tree line, dark clothing blending into the shadows, rifle raised again. Too fast, too close. David lunged forward, pushing himself off the unstable ledge, just as the gunman fired. The shot went wide, but the force of David's sudden movement sent him skidding on the wet rock. His feet slipped, his body tilted dangerously toward the drop-off. A sharp breath caught in his chest. He reached out, fingers grasping for anything solid. His hand caught the rough edge of the ridge, stopping his fall just as his legs hung over the abyss. The wind roared around him, rain battering his face, but he didn't panic. He pulled. With a grunt, he hoisted himself back onto the ledge, mud and grit covering his arms. He had lost precious seconds, seconds La Sombra could use to close in. He forced himself forward. Up ahead, Anna, Jackson, and Emilio had made it to a wider section of the ridge, ducking behind a cluster of boulders for cover. Jackson's face was pale, his injured arm pressed to his side, but he was still moving. Anna was breathing hard, scanning the path ahead. When she saw David, her expression tightened. "We're running out of room." She was right. The outcrop narrowed further ahead, leading to a bottleneck with no more cover. David's mind raced. They needed to break the pursuit. Then he spotted it. A loose rock formation, precariously perched just above the path behind them. A natural landslide waiting to happen. David turned to Emilio. That rock, how stable is it? Emilio followed his gaze, his eyes widening slightly. Not stable at all. David didn't hesitate. He moved fast, scrambling toward the weakest part of the formation. Jackson groaned. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." David ignored him. He placed both hands against the largest boulder, feeling the unsteady weight of it under his fingers. Then he pushed. Nothing. The storm had soaked the rock, making it slick and heavy. But it was already loose. It just needed a little more force. Emilio joined him, pressing his shoulder into the rock. "On three," he muttered. David nodded. 1. A gunshot cracked behind them, closer. 2. Footsteps thundered up the ridge, La Sombra closing the gap. 3. They shoved with everything they had. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a deep, thunderous rumble shook the ground beneath them. The boulder lurched forward, carrying an avalanche of loose rocks and debris with it. David didn't wait to see the impact. He grabbed Anna's hand, pulling her forward as the landslide cascaded down the ridge. The last thing he heard was the panicked shouts from below as the rockslide engulfed their pursuers. Then, finally, silence. The jungle below was swallowed by dust and debris. La Sombra was no longer behind them. David let out a breath. But he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Anna turned to him, her chest rising and falling with exertion. "That won't stop them forever." David nodded. "Number. But it buys us time." Emilio ran a hand through his wet hair, exhaling sharply. "That was reckless." Jackson let out a breathless laugh, leaning against a rock. "That was genius." David wasn't sure which it was, but one thing was certain. La Sombra would regroup, and next time, they wouldn't just send a few men. He turned to Anna. "Your father needs to get here now." She nodded, already reaching for the satellite phone. They had won this round. But the real fight was just beginning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky heavy with fading clouds and a forest floor soaked in rain. The ridge where David, Anna, Jackson, and Emilio had made their stand now sat in eerie silence, the dust from the landslide still lingering in the air. The rocks had done their job. La Sombra's pursuit had been halted, at least for now. But everyone knew that this wasn't over. David's muscles ached, his body bruised from the brutal escape, but his mind remained razor-sharp. He stood slightly apart from the others, eyes scanning the jungle below, watching for movement. No signs of pursuit yet. But if there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was that an enemy like La Sombra never stayed down for long. Anna sat on a fallen log, gripping the satellite phone in her hands, her knuckles white. She had already tried calling her father twice. No answer. David exhaled. "Try again." She did. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a click. A familiar voice came through the line, deep and controlled, despite the situation. "Ryan Montoya." "Anna." Relief flickered across her face for a moment, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of everything they had to say. "Papa, we don't have much time," she said, her voice steady despite everything they had been through. "La Sombra is here. They were tracking us before we even crashed." A brief pause. Then Ryan's voice sharpened. "Where are you?" David took the phone from Anna before she could answer. "We're holding position on the western ridge, near the old storage cabin," he said. "But listen to me. You can't come in blind. This isn't a ransom demand anymore." Ryan was silent for a second before responding. "How bad?" David glanced at Emilio, who had been watching the conversation unfold. This was his moment to step in. "Bad." Emilio said, stepping forward and taking the phone. They're using you to draw out something bigger. If you walk into this thinking it's a simple trade, you'll be walking into a bullet. Ryan exhaled on the other end of the line. I know who they are. David wasn't surprised. A man like Ryan Montoya had likely spent years navigating powerful enemies, but knowing about La Sombra and surviving them were two very different things. Ryan's voice returned firm. I'm already en route. David's grip on the phone tightened. How long? 30 minutes. David's mind worked fast. 30 minutes was both an eternity and no time at all. They had to be ready. Because if Ryan was coming, La Sombra wouldn't be far behind. He handed the phone back to Anna, who spoke quickly. We'll be waiting. The call ended. Jackson, who had been quiet, let out a slow breath. Well, guess we're having company. David turned to Emilio. How does this play out? Emilio's face was unreadable. That depends. On what? Emilio met his gaze. On whether your boss is coming to negotiate or to fight. The air around them felt heavier, charged with the anticipation of what was to come. 30 minutes. That was all the time they had, before everything would reach its inevitable conclusion. Before Ryan Montoya arrived. Before La Sombra made their next move. David turned toward the others. They couldn't just wait for the fight to come to them. They had to be ready. Emilio, how will they approach? Emilio crossed his arms, his gaze flickering toward the jungle. They'll be cautious now. We bought ourselves time with the rock slide, but they won't underestimate us again. They'll send a scout team first, moving from multiple angles, testing for weaknesses. He glanced at David. If they see Montoya arriving, they'll reposition to cut him off before he reaches us. David nodded. That was exactly what he would do in their position. Cut off reinforcements. Separate the target. Strike fast. Anna pushed to her feet, her expression sharp. So, we make sure that doesn't happen. Jackson let out a breath, shaking his head. We're running on fumes here. What exactly are you suggesting? That we take them on? Oh no, David said firmly. We don't fight them head on. We control the battlefield. He pointed toward the ridge path, leading down to the clearing. They'll expect us to hold our ground, to make this a last stand. But if we move to higher ground, we can see them coming before they're in position. Anna caught on immediately. We don't let them set the terms. Exactly, David confirmed. We stay mobile. Force them to react, instead of executing their plan. Emilio nodded approvingly. Not bad. He turned to the group. We move now. They grabbed what little supplies they had left and made their way up the ridge, every step deliberate. The storm had passed, but the jungle remained thick with mist, the wet ground slippery beneath their boots. As they climbed, the sound of distant movement reached them. David froze. Anna sucked in a sharp breath. The jungle wasn't silent anymore. La Sombra was here. David gestured for the others to move faster, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. They were running out of time. Then, from the clearing below, headlights appeared. A convoy. Ryan Montoya had arrived. For a moment, David felt a strange sense of relief, until Emilio cursed under his breath. They're too exposed. David's stomach tightened. He was right. Montoya's convoy was driving straight into La Sombra's line of fire. Then, before anyone could shout a warning, the first gunshot cracked through the jungle. Ryan's lead vehicle jerked violently, tires screeching as it swerved off the dirt road. More gunfire erupted, sharp bursts of sound cutting through the trees. David's instincts took over. Move, he barked, breaking into a sprint toward the clearing. Anna and Jackson were right behind him, Emilio cursing but following close. They couldn't afford to wait. If La Sombra cut off Ryan now, it was over. David ran faster, down the ridge, straight into the fight. The clearing was chaos. Ryan Montoya had stepped out of his SUV, flanked by his personal security team, but they were already pinned down. La Sombra moved like ghosts, shifting through the tree line, their positions hidden, but their firepower undeniable. David slid behind cover near Ryan, his mind already processing the battlefield. "We have to move, now." Ryan's expression remained calm, but his eyes flickered with calculation. "How many?" David didn't hesitate. "At least 6, maybe more." Ryan nodded once, signaling to his men. They were prepared for this. Then he looked at Anna. His expression softened, just for a moment. "Are you hurt?" Anna shook her head. "Number. But we need to get out of here." Ryan turned back toward the jungle, his voice firm. "We're not leaving until this is finished." David understood immediately. Ryan Montoya didn't just come to escape. He came to end it. A crack of gunfire sent bark exploding from a nearby tree. David ducked, his adrenaline sharp. They had seconds to act. He turned to Ryan. "We cut through the west trail. Get back to the ridge." Ryan's security team moved fast, covering their retreat, as David and Anna stayed close. Jackson, despite his injury, kept moving, his face pale but determined. Emilio was the last to fall back, covering them as they pushed up the ridge. The gunfire behind them began to die down, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. La Sombra was pulling back. They had failed to separate Montoya. The moment was lost. And just like that, it was over. An hour later, the jungle was quiet. David stood near the convoy, watching as Ryan spoke with his team. No casualties, no one taken. La Sombra had vanished, just as they had appeared. Anna stepped beside David. She was exhausted but steady, her gaze fixed on her father. "He knew this would happen," she said quietly. David nodded. "That's why he came prepared." She exhaled. "Then why does it feel like we still lost something?" David didn't answer. Because he knew the truth. This wasn't the end of La Sombra. Ryan Montoya had won this round. But power plays never ended with one battle. There would be another day, another fight. But for now, they had survived. And for David, that was enough.